I've been thinking about Perez's 2024 season and why he was dropped for Lawson at the end of it, because I don't think Perez is a bad driver. For example, at the end of the 2020 season, Perez would find himself last at the end of lap 1 in the Sakira Grand Prix, and he would go on to win that race in a team that placed 4th in the championship. However, exactly 4 years later, he would be cut from the grid after signing a contract extension just months before. So how did this happen? Hey, I'm Anthony. After crunching some numbers and looking at Sergio Perez's season in 2024, I was able to get a better idea as to how much he managed to cost the team and why they decided to replace him even after extending his contract just months before. So let's dive a little bit deeper into just how bad Sergio Perez was in 2024. Let's start off with Red Bull. Red Bull had one of the best seasons as a team in Formula 1 history in 2023, winning 21 of the 22 races. This puts them up there with some of the most dominant teams in history, like McLaren's 88 team for example. That means that Red Bull had a humongous amount of momentum going into the 2024 season, which they managed to capitalize on. Max Verstappen would go on to win 4 of the first 5 races in 2024, and the only reason why he didn't win all 5 was due to a mechanical failure at Australia. Perez would even match Verstappen's great start by securing points in all 5 starts, with 4 of them being podiums. By the end of the Chinese Grand Prix, most fans, including myself, were ready to just sit back and accept that once again, Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez would use their RB20 to dominate another season. However, Red Bull's story would shift very quickly after this race. In fact, the Chinese Grand Prix would be the last podium of Sergio Perez's Formula 1 career. Perez scored 85 points in those first 5 races. This is more points than he would score in the next 19, as for the rest of the season, he would only score a combined 67 points. Now, is this really just Sergio Perez's fault, or was this a collective downfall from the Red Bull team? Let's be honest, most teams would be pretty happy with a 3rd place finish in the championship. In fact, I vividly remember McLaren, who would go on to win the Constructors' Championship for the first time in nearly 20 years in 2024, being extremely happy with their 3rd place finish in the very same season that Perez went last to 1st at Bahrain. However, for Red Bull, finishing 3rd in a season right after dominating both championships is not only poor, but genuinely confusing and left everyone from owners to even their fans wondering what the hell went wrong. But this is why I love Formula 1 as a sport. Stats and results don't always tell the full story, because while Red Bull did finish 3rd in the Constructors' Championship last year, it wasn't because they were the 3rd fastest car on the grid. Let's start off with Red Bull's biggest loss in 2024, Adrian Newey. Newey had played an instrumental role in Red Bull's success ever since he left McLaren in 2006. He had the main hand in building the cars that would go on to help Sebastian Vettel win 4 championships in a row between 2010 and 2013. He would do something similar with Max Verstappen, helping him win all of his championships. However, in May 2024, Adrian shocked the F1 world by announcing his departure from Red Bull. This was a huge loss to the team, as Adrian is seen as one of the best to ever do it. Then you have the issues with the RB20, with Red Bull claiming that the issues actually started with the RB19 in 2023, with one of their upgrades seemingly being beneficial at the time, but in hindsight became the catalyst to their 2024 decline. You even had Newey, who had claimed that Red Bull had just completely dismissed the emergent issues of the design philosophy in 2023 with the RB19, as it didn't really impact their results. However, after his departure in 2024, Red Bull started to suffer as they struggled to manage the growing issue. It had gotten to the point that now that McLaren were challenging them, that even Max Verstappen was slowly starting to struggle with the issues. And then lastly, when it came to Red Bull's overall decline in 2024, you have Perez himself. It's not completely incorrect to say that Sergio's bad performances in 2024 not only cost Red Bull the Constructors' title, but also 2nd place to Ferrari. While Max's overall dominance on the grid did decline after Miami, just like Sergio Perez's performances did, their fall was not as massive. Max would still go on to win 5 more Grand Prix that season after the Chinese Grand Prix, averaging 17.2 points per race throughout the rest of the season. Now, what do you think Perez's average points throughout the rest of the season after the Chinese Grand Prix was? 9? Maybe even 10? 13 points? 3.5. Sergio Perez averaged 3.5 points from Miami all the way to Abu Dhabi. Now, just to prove that Perez did cause Red Bull to not only lose 1st place in the championship, but 2nd place as well, here's a statistic that blew my mind when I was doing my research for this video. If we were to just simply double Perez's average points per race from Miami to Abu Dhabi to just 7 from 3.5, Red Bull would have won the Constructors' Championship by 56 points last year. Instead, they finished third, finishing 77 points behind the winners, McLaren. So while Sergio was not the sole reason, in my opinion, for Red Bull's downfall in 2024 compared to their 2023 season, he was definitely the main reason for it. I want to start off by covering Perez's form at the beginning of the season because it was actually incredibly consistent. As I mentioned before, Perez secured 4 podiums in the first 5 races, and he even finished 5th in the race that he didn't score a podium. In fact, if you were to just calculate Perez's average points from the first 5 races and compare them to Max's final 19 races, they actually match, with Perez averaging 17 points per race. And if you was to compare this form to Lando Norris's final 5 races, where he was trying to catch up to Max Verstappen to challenge him for the driver's title, it even surpasses his, with Lando only averaging 15.4 points per race towards the end of the season. So it's pretty safe to say that Perez had a great start. But how was the rest of the season compared to it? Well, after Miami, his best run of performances came between the Hungarian and Azerbaijan GP, where he would score points in 4 of the 5 races. However, he only managed to score an average score of 5 points per race during this time. Most people, including his own fans, would probably agree that Lewis Hamilton hasn't been able to perform to his best during his last few years at Mercedes. We're talking about a 7-time world champion here, so going 2 seasons without a win isn't great for someone of his standards, and his start to 2024 was no different. However, in my opinion, this only goes to highlight Perez's decline even more, because Hamilton's 2024 start is the only comparable stretch of 5 races in 2024 that matches Perez's best run after Miami, with Lewis averaging 5.4 points per race from Australia to Imola. And as a comparison, Lewis would then average 10.9 points per race from Imola to Abu Dhabi relative to Perez's 2.3 points per race. So what does all of these stats mean when it comes to Sergio Perez's season? For me, I think that Perez's season is the result of his own mental battle not being able to extract similar amounts of speed out of the car to Max Verstappen. While Max at his worst was still competing for a solid amount of points every single race, Perez at his best was scrapping for food stamps. This does a lot to an athlete's mindset about themselves and compounds into even more poor performances. Let's take Hamilton again as another example. With his qualifying, we're talking about a man who managed to beat a supercomputer's theoretical best lap time by 0.6 of a second when he performed one of the best pole laps in the last decade at Singapore in 2018. Yet in 2024, even when he had competitive pace the entire weekend, when it came to Q3, he wasn't able to perform as well as George Russell. With Lewis being absolutely demoralized, he would go on record multiple times in front of the media to say, "I'm slow and there's not much I can do about it." So that's why I personally think that half of Perez's decline comes from his own mindset and comparing himself to Max and other top second drivers around him like Carlos Sainz and Oscar Piastri, or even first drivers from the midfield teams like Pierre Gasly, who by the way averaged 6.8 points in the last 5 races. This, combined with his general decline in performance, matched with Red Bull's issues with the RB20, led to his worst season since 2020. Considering that he clearly cost Red Bull not only P1 but P2 in the championship, there's no wonder he was replaced. Does this mean that Sergio Perez is a bad Grand Prix driver overall? No, I don't think so personally. I mean, we have guys like Lance Stroll on the grid, we had Logan Sargent, and a couple of years ago we even had Nikita Mazepin, so clearly I don't think Perez is that bad, he just had a really bad season. But speaking of that bad season, let's compare his run from Imola to Abu Dhabi against some of the worst runs that we've seen in the last 20 years from drivers who raced in a top 3 team. Taking a look at some of the worst final stretch of races from a driver in a top 3 team in the last 20 years, you have in 5th place Kimi Räikkönen in 2006 with McLaren. In 4th you have Juan Pablo Montoya, also with McLaren, also in 2006. In 3rd you have Heikki Kovalainen with McLaren but in 2009. In 2nd you have Giancarlo Fisichella with Renault in 2007. And then you have the worst final stretch of races from a driver in a top 3 team in the last 20 years, Rubens Barrichello in 2005 with Ferrari. So let's break this down a little bit. As I mentioned before, Kimi and Juan Pablo, both racing in McLaren in 2006, scored 20 points each from the last 5 races of that season. This averages out to 4 points per race. In a time when drivers received less points per race, this isn't too bad, but it's still not great from a top 3 team. Next up, we have Kovalainen. Again, for McLaren, he only managed to score 5 points from the last 5 races in 2009. This is a huge jump down from Kimi and Juan, only averaging 1 point per race. In second, we have Giancarlo, who in 2007 with Renault only scored 4 points in the last 5 races, averaging out at 0.8 points per race. And lastly, we have Rubens Barrichello in 2005 with Ferrari, only scoring 3 points. This averages out to 0.6 points per race. As I mentioned before, all of these drivers drove during a time when less points were given out per race. So before I adjust those points to today's standards, I want to quickly mention that from my brief research, the people that you see on screen are today's current worst performers in the last 5 races with the current point system. So after adjusting the previous points from the bottom 5 into today's points, to be honest, there's no point in showing you because they're all better than Sergio Perez anyway. With just 2 points scored in the final 5 races of the season in 2024, Perez averaged 0.4 points per race, which is still lower than Rubens Barrichello's average without the adjustment. Meaning statistically, out of every driver who has scored at least 1 point in the last 5 races of the season that raced in a top 3 team, Perez has had the worst end to a season in the last 20 years. So because of that, I think it's pretty easy to say that 2024 Perez was very bad. But talking about how and why Perez was as bad gives us a little bit of a clearer picture on the whole story, as he wasn't bad throughout his entire stint with Red Bull. In my opinion, this is just a clear-cut case of his mental mindset compounding his drop in performance and turning into an utter catastrophe of a season. Now, I want to hear from you guys. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think of Sergio Perez in general, and what do you think based on his 2024 season? If you would like to see how the RB19 stacks up to some of the more dominant cars in Formula 1 history, then check out how I calculated the most dominant F1 car on the left. And if you want to see why this record that Max Verstappen set will never be beaten again, then check out my video on F1 achievements that will never happen again on the right.